CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The World Today, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie O. In our top stories, dozens killed in Myanmar as anti-military protests continue against the army takeover. High hopes at high tide to refloat the container ship still blocking the Suez Canal. Protests in the United States calling for an end to hate crimes and discrimination. We're live in New York.
I can see absolutely nothing in the data to dissuade me from continuing along our roadmap to freedom.
And the UK starts to ease lockdowns, but mainland Europe is bracing itself for a third wave of coronavirus. In Myanmar, dozens of people have been killed during protests as the country's military celebrated Armed Forces Day. More than 400 people have now been killed since the army seized power in February. The country's ousted democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi remains detained at an undisclosed location. Jemima Walker reports.
They turned out in their thousands, despite a stark warning from the army that protesters could be shot in the head. Demonstrations across the country started peacefully but quickly escalated. The leader of one of Myanmar's armed ethnic groups called Saturday a day of shame.
I have warned the army multiple times to stop murdering the people. If they continue to shoot at protesters and bully the people, I think the ethnic group would not just stand by and do nothing.
While the death toll from protests climbed, military chiefs celebrated Armed Forces Day, marked by parades and flyovers. The head of the army promised to safeguard democracy.
The nation practices the multi-party democracy system by the people's desire since 2011 and stands tall as a union based on democracy and federalism. Therefore, I'd like to impart that it should not be acceptable to put forward a proposition by terrorism.
Armed Forces Day parades are normally attended by diplomats from other countries. But this year it was only Russia which turned out to signal its position. Moscow's deputy defense minister met with leaders from Myanmar's army. Myanmar's army chief reiterated his pledge to hold elections, but hasn't provided a time frame. With protests against the military takeover continuing daily, it's unlikely the promise of a vote will bring quiet to the streets or provide reassurance to the international community. Jemima Walker, CGTN.
One of the biggest shipping vessels in the world remains stuck in one of the world's busiest trading routes. The container ship, the Ever Given, has been stuck sideways in Egypt's Suez Canal since Tuesday. It was heading from China to Europe. The authorities there say they hope to refloat the ship with tugboats at high tide. Another slower option would be to lighten its load by removing containers. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Adele El Marouki, who's in Suez for us. Adele, time really is of the essence here. Each day is holding up billions of dollars in global trade. What's the latest?
321 ships are stranded on both sides of the Suez Canal. The number is growing from just 50 on the first day, and it keeps getting bigger. And that's because the maritime waterway in Egypt, it saves a lot of time, a week of travel in waters, and of course a lot of fuel. And that's why it's still, despite the current blockage, is more or less preferable for most transportation vessels, unless, of course, they are running out of time. And now, every day, $1.9 billion worth of goods goes through the Suez Canal. This is the fourth day now, so the toll is getting bigger, and of course the longer it takes, the worse it will get.
Now we're waiting for high tide. If the tugboats cannot tow the vessel free on high tide, what are the next steps?
Well, Authorities had hoped that they were just very close to float the boat, and after they reached a depth of 18 meters under it with excavation process. But right when they reached the desired depth, low tide came in and dropped by about 2 meters, which has ruined everything. So now they're still hoping that they can proceed with the excavations and therefore be able to float the boat. But their final procedure will be to lift, as you said, the containers of the vessel. They will get ships and cranes to pick it up, to lift up the weight a bit so that it can float and compensate for the loss.
Adel Al-Marouki in Suez, thank you very much indeed. Protests are expected in major cities in the United States, calling for an end to hate crimes and discrimination against Asian Americans. There's been an increase in verbal harassment and physical assaults since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. But anger boiled over after the killing of 6 Asian American women in Georgia. The rally in New York gets underway in about an hour. Our correspondent John Terrett is there for us. John, good to see you. First of all, what exactly is planned?
Well, I think the title of this nationwide event pretty much says it all. It is called Stop Anti-Asian Crime, Stop China Bashing. It's really all you need to know. And here in New York there will be 2 events. One is at Flushing in the borough of Queens, which is really the center of the Chinese community in New York City, and also here at Borough Hall in Brooklyn. But there are events taking place all over the country in cities that you will know very well: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Boston, Philly, and of course Atlanta, where just over a week ago 6 women of Asian descent were killed in their workplace, which was a day spa in the city. But there have been spikes in anti-Asian crime reported by police forces all over the United States, and it's making the Asian community here very, very unnerved indeed. Now, what is new about this, Jamie, what is different, is that the attacks we're seeing, some of them are on parents and aunties and uncles and grandparents, and that's making the younger members of the Asian community here very angry indeed. Now, I don't want you to run away with the idea that this is happening all over, all the time. It's not quite like that, but it is forcing many members of the Asian community to stay indoors and to watch where they walk when they are out and about. And only on Friday, within the last 24-hour news cycle, there was an attack on an Asian woman very close to the CGTN offices in Midtown Manhattan. It's been captured on cell phone, as so many of these things are, and she was verbally abused with anti-Asian slurs. Now, she's okay, but that's an example of what can happen even in the center of a city like New York. And the Asian community here largely blame former President Trump for the China virus rhetoric that he came out with so often during the course of his 4 years in the White House. They say they see that as the seed of the problem here. Jamie?
John, protest is one thing. In terms of policy, what precisely is being called for in terms of change?
It's very difficult to effect change on things like this because, as you know, the United States has an issue with racism generally that stretches back many hundreds of years. What the organizers want is obviously an immediate end to the spitting and to the verbal abuse and to the physical abuse which is taking place. President Biden has openly and loudly called for attacks on Asians to stop. He said that when CGTN was in Atlanta last week. And I think the organizers would like to see 2 other things as well. First of all, the positioning of more Asians in positions of political power at all levels of politics across the United States, and the greater teaching of Asian history in U.S. schools. And an example of that would be that in the Second World War, 120,000 Japanese were kept in internment camps here. That's an example of something that I think the Asian community would be happy to see taught in a much wider fashion in U.S. schools. Now, to finish off, The New York Police Department, within the last handful of months, has started what it calls an Asian hate crimes unit. It's staffed by 25 detectives, all of them from Asian descent. They speak around 10 languages, including Mandarin, of course, and also Tagalog as well, the Philippines language. But many in the Asian community say, look, this is too little too late, it's too understaffed, it's too slow in investigating what's going on, because very often, once the perpetrator has done what he or she is going to do to a member of the Asian community, they're often long gone by the time the police get there, if it's ever reported at all. Jamie?
John Terrace in New York, thank you very much for that. Well, let's explore this a little further now with our guest, Arnold Marr. He was inspired to begin a campaign, #EveryAsianVoice, on the back of rising racist violence the community faced in the wake of COVID's arrival in Europe, and he's got something of an international footprint with bases in London, Shanghai and New York. Arnold, good to see you. Welcome. Is racism towards specifically the Asian community any different to racism to any other community? Racism is racism, isn't it?
Yeah, Jamie, thank you for having me. I agree with you. I think there's a distinct, lack of representation for all minorities. And I agree that racism is racism. I guess the situation might be slightly different.
Do you think, and in your experience, has the pandemic made this worse?
Yeah, I think it has. As mentioned earlier, I think a lot of this narrative came from the back of coronavirus by state leaders like Trump and Farage, Nigel Farage as well, to almost blame China for the coronavirus in mainstream media.
I wonder if any of this is new, or do we simply know much more about it because of awareness, because of reporting and social media?
Yeah, I think the systemic racism isn't new. So I just want to quickly explain that as an Asian, we're taught from a very young age, right, to kind of like stay to ourselves, to stay out of trouble, focus on work and academia. This is something that's culturally quite prevalent in the Chinese and Asian society in general. So we kind of just focus on our professions, we focus on academia, we kind of almost learn to ignore the hate and racism, and we suppress our own voices almost. And this mixed in with the recent narrative around coronavirus, and I guess also around the lack of representation in mainstream media, entertainment, politics, professions. All of these things create a lack of voice, and the lack of voice creates a lack of awareness, and this perpetuates almost kind of more hate crimes, microaggressions, and it just builds up. And I think the recent events, accumulation of what's been happening over the past few decades of the systemic racism that happens, not just in America, but in a lot of Western countries.
I guess one of the key problems here is unreported racism, whether you're sitting in Europe or the United States or anywhere else, come to that matter, that people do not report it. They feel there's no point in reporting it. And governments and police forces will say, well, we don't really know how big the problem is because people don't report it. You end up in this vicious circle, don't you?
Yeah, I think so. I just want to encourage everyone to report, and I want to give an example as well. I think all microaggressions need to be reported, and sometimes most of the people who are most vulnerable, a lot of the elderly Asians in our community, and they sometimes struggle to report. Because maybe they have language barriers, they don't know how the system works. So it's really important that we as a society also create the facility for people who are most vulnerable and not able to report so readily to do that as well. I mean, even my girlfriend recently, a couple of months ago, she was walking behind a couple of young women, and they said coronavirus is walking behind us. And, you know, this kind of microaggression, I think this all needs to be accounted for and reported, because the more we speak up, the more voices we have, the more awareness there is. And that's the start of combating the problem.
OK, speaking up is one thing to fix. What else do you do to try to fix this around the world?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I think it's really important for us to rally everyone around us to fight for something rather than fight against something, right? So we want to be mobilizing, inspiring, providing the platform for professionals, for entertainers, for every Asian in the industry to speak up about their successes, about what they're doing to contribute to the society. And this is the foundation of every Asian voice, right? It's not just about reacting to what's happening recently. It's a long-term plan to create a platform for people to speak up and integrate, inspire, educate. We want to come from a place of positivity because we believe that only then we can change the world to be a better place where everyone feels safe to walk on the street, everyone is integrated and happy.
Arnold, good to see you. Thank you very much for your time. Arnold Marr there in London.
Thank you, Jamie.
The United States has invited the leaders of China and Russia to a summit on climate change. The White House says 40 world leaders have been asked to participate in the virtual summit in April. Washington believes the climate emergency is one area where it can find common ground with Beijing and Moscow. Police and protesters have clashed for the third time in a week in the English city of Bristol. 10 people were arrested as more than 1,000 people demonstrated. They've been protesting against a new bill which would give the police more power to restrict protests. And thousands of people have been protesting in the capital of Bangladesh over a visit by the Indian Prime Minister, who they accuse of inciting religious hatred against Muslims. 4 demonstrators in Bangladesh were killed by the police on Friday. The authorities say the protesters attacked a police station. In Egypt, rail traffic has resumed a day after 2 trains crashed, killing at least 19 people. Egypt's train authorities initially said the accident happened after the emergency brakes were activated on one train, causing the second train to crash into the back of it. The Prime Minister has since said that no cause has yet been determined. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead here on The World Today, not just a pretty face, how goats and cheese making are putting Hungary on the gourmet food map.
Don't forget you can sign up to our daily newsletter. We bring you all the top business headlines straight to your inbox. So sign up for free at this address. CGTN. See the difference.
Patient after patient after patient. They take a long time to get better. They're the sickest patients we've ever seen.
It's a race against time because we can all see the threat that our NHS faces, the pressure it's under.
We're dealing with something we knew very little about.
Europe's first 2 epicentres in February have received their first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine.
Another day, another grim milestone for the UK in its fight against COVID-19. 100,000 people have now lost their lives after contracting the virus.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Dozens of people have been killed in Myanmar as anti-military protests continue against the army takeover. Our other headlines. High hopes of high tide to refloat the container ship still blocking the Suez Canal. And protests in the United States calling for an end to anti-Asian hate crimes and discrimination. China has imposed retaliatory sanctions against individuals and entities in the United States and Canada. The move comes after the 2 countries, along with the EU and the UK, jointly targeted Chinese officials over alleged human rights abuses in China's Xinjiang. Beijing denies those allegations. On Friday, China sanctioned a number of British politicians and academics. The Chinese defense minister is flying out of Serbia after ending the second leg of his tour of 4 European countries. Beijing says the visits are to boost military cooperation. CGTN's Alyosha Milenkovic reports.
The Serbian military special forces are training hard. A show for a high-profile guest from China, Defense Minister General Wei Fenghe. It was just one of the highlights of his 3-day visit to the Serbian capital, Belgrade.
The aim of my visit is to realize the consensus between President Xi Jinping and President Alexander Vučić about deepening friendly relations between our two armies.
Economic ties are the backbone of the relationship between China and Serbia. But since the COVID pandemic started, the medical collaboration became the most important area for the two nations.
Wei met Serbian President Alexander Vučić, but his most important meeting was with his Serbian counterpart, Nebojša Stefanović. After over 2 hours of talks behind closed doors, the two ministers signed an agreement on the Chinese military's donation to Serbia.
We are preparing to conduct our first joint special forces exercise by the end of the year. Serbia would send 1 platoon, or around 30 soldiers. It will be an opportunity for us to learn from our Chinese counterparts and also to share our knowledge with them.
Stefanović also announced that China would help the Serbian defense industry's efforts to perfect its indigenous attack drone, the Pegasus. Alyosha Milenkovic, CGTN, Belgrade.
China's defense minister also paid his respects at the memorial to Chinese citizens killed when a NATO airstrike hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo War. China said the incident was a war crime. NATO said it was a terrible accident and bombers targeted the wrong building. 3 Chinese journalists were killed. China's foreign minister has been meeting the president of Iran as Beijing and Tehran sign a strategic deal. The agreement looks to strengthen economic, security and defense ties. Iran is a key part of China's Belt and Road Initiative and a major oil exporter to China. As a third wave of coronavirus sweeps Europe, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he hopes the UK will continue to ease restrictions. England will start unlocking on Monday, with large parts of the economy reopening in April. Nicole Johnston reports.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he believes England is on track to come out of lockdown, according to the government's timetable.
And as things stand, I can see absolutely nothing in the data to dissuade me from continuing along our roadmap to freedom, unlocking our economy and getting back to the life we love. And of course, there are plenty of risks, and we've got to be honest about the difficulties ahead.
From Saturday, Wales starts easing its lockdown with unrestricted travel within its borders. And from Monday in England, up to 6 people can meet outdoors. But outdoor dining won't start until the 12th of April at the earliest. Meanwhile, the British government is aiming to give people 70 years and over a COVID-19 booster shot from September. The vaccine minister says the booster will protect them from variants of the virus, like the strains first identified in South Africa and Brazil. The priority will be to give the booster shots to the elderly, clinically vulnerable and health and social care staff. More than 29 million people across the UK have already received their first shot of the vaccine, in one of the fastest rollouts in the world. But the UK has been troubled by ongoing problems with the European Union over vaccine supplies, and fears that the EU could choke off supplies to the UK. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
In Europe, people returning to Germany from France now face new coronavirus restrictions. Meanwhile, a special concert is taking place in Spain to test if similar events might take place in the future. Rahul Pathak reports from Madrid.
Travellers arriving in Germany from France now need to show a negative COVID-19 test and quarantine. It follows the announcement from Germany that it now considers France as an area of high risk.
It's a bit crazy because you have to take a test to be allowed to fly, and within 24 hours of flying, the test result doesn't change that much because everyone else who flies also has a negative test.
Meanwhile, here in Spain, all eyes will be on Barcelona as a concert is due to take place using special anti-COVID-19 measures. Now, 5,000 people are due to attend the gig by Spanish indie outfit Love of Lesbian. Now, there won't be any social distancing involved, but fans will have had to have taken a same-day COVID-19 test and wear a mask at all times. Finally, in Poland, police are cracking down on people flouting anti-COVID lockdown laws. This illegal bar in Warsaw was posing as a fashion show. Many people in Poland have lost their jobs and livelihoods due to the pandemic's financial fallout.
We are one step away from crossing the border beyond which we will not be able to properly heal patients, heal our citizens. We must do everything to avoid such a scenario.
Many Poles claim they're being forced into breaking the law to maintain an income as government support has been negligible. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Goats in Hungary are giving a boost to disabled and disadvantaged people and putting locally produced cheeses on the international gourmet map. The social enterprise employs people in a goat farm and cheese factory. Julia Chapman reports.
These goats are more than just a source of milk. They also provide an opportunity for those in need. The farm offers work for disabled, disadvantaged and minority groups. 64-year-old Marika is from Hungary's Roma community. She was living on a small pension when the farm opened.
Some friends came and asked if I wanted to work here. I was pleased to say yes. I'm still here. I do everything to the best of my abilities. They are satisfied with me, and so am I with them.
This is one of the poorest parts of Hungary. Well-paying jobs can be hard to come by, particularly for those facing stigmatization.
The idea behind all this is that we provide employment locally to people who otherwise couldn't possibly find any job in this region. It is very important that they stay here and work here, so we created 20 jobs.
Goat farming was chosen as a trade with local roots. It also offers a direct form of income. Milk from the goat farm ends up here at a factory that's also part of the enterprise. Workers have developed skills to make cheese and other products that end up at markets across the region. This initiative got off the ground with government, EU and Red Cross funding. It's not quite operating at a profit, but its owners hope that it can become a sustainable project and an example for others to help the marginalised find steady work. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Mezachat, Hungary.
This Saturday evening marks the annual Earth Hour, and it's online this year. Millions of people across the globe will switch off their non-essential lights at 8:30 p.m. local time for 1 hour. The switch off is a symbolic gesture to show solidarity with the planet, and participation in Earth Hour shows a commitment to change beyond just the hour. To see more, europe.cgtn.com. And finally, it looks like the underworld with apocalyptic infernos, or perhaps a scene from Lord of the Rings. You're actually looking at Iceland, where thousands of tourists are flocking to see lava fountains. They're still spewing more than 1 week after that volcanic eruption. Volcanologists say the lava may settle down at any moment, or it could go on for years. Some of the tourists say it's been a welcome distraction from the pandemic. The headlines again. In Myanmar, dozens of people have been killed during protests as the country's military celebrated Armed Forces Day. More than 400 people have now been killed since the army seized power in February. The country's ousted democratically elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, remains detained at an undisclosed location. And that's it for The World Today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget we're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as CGTN.com and the CGTN app. Coming up next on CGTN, it's The Agenda with Stephen Cole. But from me, goodbye.